There are moments in history when the fate of empires turns on words spoken between a father and his son. In the ancient world, when gods still walked through the minds of men and oaths were carved into the very soul, one such moment occurred in a temple shadowed by war. A boy, no more than 9 years old, stood before an altar. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, steady, firm, eternal. The flames flickered. The priest waited. And in that hushed, sacred space, a promise was made that would echo across continents and centuries. This is the story of that boy. His name was Hannibal Barca. To understand Hannibal, one must first understand the world into which he was born. A world still trembling from the aftershocks of a great and terrible conflict. The First Punic War had ended just 6 years before his birth, a grinding, brutal struggle that had lasted nearly a generation. Rome and Carthage, two powers locked in a contest for supremacy over the Western Mediterranean, had collided with the kind of violence that reshapes maps and memories alike. Carthage had lost. But loss for Carthage did not mean surrender of spirit. It meant something quieter, more dangerous. A wound that would not close, a grievance nursed in the dark. Picture Carthage as it was in those days, in the year 247 BC, when Hannibal drew his first breath. The city sat on the North African coast, like a jewel set in stone, its harbours opening to the Mediterranean, like cupped hands, receiving offerings from distant shores. The Phoenician ancestors of the Carthaginians had built this city centuries before, and their legacy lingered in every column, every ship, every whispered prayer to Baal and Tanit. At dusk, when the sun melted into the western waters, Carthage transformed. The white limestone buildings turned gold, then amber, then a soft, fading rose. Ships rocked gently in the circular military harbour, their masts creating a forest of silent sentinels. Merchants finished their business in the great marketplace. Families gathered on rooftops to catch the evening breeze. The air smelled of salt and spices, of cedarwood and distant lands. But beneath the beauty, there was something else. A tension, a weight that pressed down on every stone and every soul. The war had taken its toll. Sicily, that great island so close to Italy, had been lost. Sardinia would soon follow, seized by Rome in a moment of opportunistic betrayal. The Carthaginian treasury was depleted. Pride had been damaged in ways that gold could never quite repair. Yet Carthage still stood. Wounded, yes. Diminished, perhaps, but not broken. Into this world of fading glory and quiet defiance, Hannibal Barca was born. His family name, Barca, meant lightning. It was an appropriate name for a clan that had come to embody both brilliance and sudden, devastating force. The Barcids were an old family, respected in Carthage, though not of the oldest aristocracy. They had earned their standing through service, through military command, through the kind of steady competence that makes empires function, even when they are under strain. Hannibal's father was Hamilcar Barca, a man whose name was already well known by the time his son arrived. Hamilcar had distinguished himself in the final years of the First Punic War, commanding Carthaginian forces in Sicily with a tenacity that had earned him both respect and frustration from his enemies. He had not been defeated in battle. Rome had simply outlasted Carthage, worn it down through attrition and relentless naval superiority. When peace came, Hamilcar had returned home with his reputation intact, but his mission incomplete. He was a man of steady resolve, Hamilcar, not given to grand speeches or theatrical gestures, but possessed of an unshakable belief that Carthage's story was not yet finished. He looked at his city, bruised and diminished, and saw not an ending, but a pause, a chance to rebuild, to adapt, to prepare for what might come next. And so, when his son was born, Hamilcar must have looked at the infant with a particular kind of hope, the hope that one generation might finish what another had begun. Hannibal grew up in a household where war was not an abstraction, but a living memory. The men who visited his father's home were veterans, strategists, merchants who had seen distant lands. Conversations at dinner were about supply lines and ship construction, about alliances with Numidian princes and the politics of the Carthaginian Senate. The boy listened. Carthage was a cosmopolitan city, a place where languages mixed and mingled like currents in the harbour. Hannibal learned Punic, the language of his ancestors, but also Greek, which was the language of learning and diplomacy across the Mediterranean world. Perhaps he picked up some Latin as well, the tongue of the enemy that had humbled his city. He learned to read, to calculate, to understand the maps that his father studied late into the night. But more than facts and figures, Hannibal absorbed something else from his early years, a sense of purpose, a direction. His father did not speak of revenge in crude terms. Hamilcar was too sophisticated, too strategic for that, but he spoke of restoration, of justice, of Carthage reclaiming its rightful place among the powers of the world. And always, in the background of every conversation, like a shadow that could not be ignored, there was Rome. The story of the oath has been told so many times that it has taken on the quality of legend. But legends, like all stories worth remembering, often contain truth at their core. Whether it happened exactly as later writers described, or whether it occurred in some different form, the essence of the moment remains. Hannibal was 9 years old. His father was preparing to leave Carthage, to take command of an expedition to Iberia, that distant land of mountains and rivers, where Carthage hoped to rebuild its strength and its fortunes. The boy asked to come along, any child would. The prospect of adventure, of leaving the familiar streets of home for something new and unknown, must have been intoxicating. Hamilcar could have said no. He could have told his son to stay, to continue his education in Carthage, to wait until he was older. But he did not. Instead, he brought the boy to a temple, a place sacred to the gods of Carthage, where oaths carried weight beyond mere words. The temple would have been quiet at that hour, cool and shadowed. Sunlight filtering through the entrance would have illuminated dust motes hanging in the air. The altar stood at the center, ancient stone marked with the remnants of countless offerings. Hannibal stood before it, small in that vast, echoing space. His father's hand rested on his shoulder. The priest waited, and Hamilcar asked his son to swear an oath. The exact words are lost to time. Different sources give different versions, but the meaning was clear. Hannibal was to swear eternal enmity toward Rome, not hatred in the mindless, destructive sense, but enmity, a solemn commitment to oppose Rome, to remember what had been done to Carthage, to carry forward the mission his father had begun. For a 9-year-old boy, such an oath might seem like play acting, like a child's game of soldiers and oaths and grand pronouncements. But Hannibal was not an ordinary child. He had grown up in the shadow of war. He had heard the stories. He had seen the wounded men, the empty spaces where Carthaginian power used to be. And he understood, in whatever way a 9-year-old can understand such things, that this oath was not a game. He spoke the words. His father listened. The gods, if they cared at all about the promises of mortals, took note. And with that oath, Hannibal Barca's life took on a shape and a trajectory that would carry him across mountains, through battles, into history itself. Soon after, the Barca family prepared to leave Carthage. Hamilcar had been appointed to lead an expedition to Iberia, what the Romans called Hispania, a land rich in silver and resources, but distant, rugged, and not fully under Carthaginian control. It was a chance to rebuild Carthaginian strength far from Roman interference, to create a new base of power in the West. The journey itself must have been extraordinary for a young boy who had never left the shores of North Africa. Ships loaded with soldiers and supplies, cutting through the Mediterranean waves. The coast of Iberia rising on the horizon, green and brown and impossibly vast. Landing on foreign soil, hearing new languages, seeing tribes and peoples who knew nothing of Carthage or Rome or the great wars that occupied the thoughts of Mediterranean powers. Iberia was different from North Africa. The land was harder, more varied. There were coastal plains and mountain ranges, river valleys and high plateaus. The people were fierce, divided into numerous tribes with their own customs and loyalties. It would take time, patience, and careful diplomacy to bring them into Carthage's sphere of influence. Hamilcar approached the task with characteristic steadiness. He did not try to conquer through brute force alone. He built alliances. He married into local nobility. He established strongholds and trading posts. Slowly, methodically, he extended Carthaginian influence across southern Iberia. And through it all, Hannibal watched and learned. He saw how his father dealt with tribal chiefs, how he balanced firmness with flexibility, how he turned potential enemies into allies. He learned the languages of the Iberian peoples. He adapted to the climate, to the terrain, to the rhythms of a world far from the civilized harbors of Carthage. These were formative years for the boy. He was growing up not in the comfort of a great city, but on the frontier, in a place where Carthaginian power was still being built, still being defined. He learned to ride, to live rough when necessary, to understand the importance of logistics and planning. He saw his father work with steady determination, never rushing, always building for the long term. And then, when Hannibal was still young, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, his father died. The circumstances were sudden and unexpected. Hamilcar was campaigning against one of the Iberian tribes, pursuing enemies who had retreated across a river. Accounts vary, as they always do with ancient sources, but the outcome was the same. Hamilcar Barca drowned. Some say the river was swollen and treacherous. Others suggest he was struck down while trying to cover his son's retreat. The details fade into the uncertainty of distance and time. What remains is the loss. The man who had shaped Carthage's strategy in Iberia, who had taught his son about duty and purpose and the long game of nations, was gone. The expedition could have collapsed at that moment. The Carthaginian presence in Iberia could have unraveled, but it did not. Hamilcar's son-in-law, Hasdrubal, later called Hasdrubal the Fair to distinguish him from Hannibal's brother of the same name, took command. The transition was smooth, a testament to the foundation Hamilcar had built. The soldiers remained loyal. The Iberian alliances held. And Hannibal, still too young for supreme command but old enough to serve, continued his education in the ways of leadership and war. The death of Hamilcar marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The boy who had sworn an oath at age 9 was now a young man, shaped by loss, by exile from his homeland, by years spent learning the craft of building an empire on foreign soil. But the story was far from over. In the mountains and valleys of Iberia, far from the grand chambers of Carthage and Rome, a new generation was rising. Hannibal Barca had inherited more than just his father's name. He had inherited a mission, a vision, and an oath that bound him to a destiny he could not yet fully imagine. The child born under a shadow was becoming something else. A commander, a strategist, a man who would carry his father's dreams across the breadth of the known world. The years ahead would test him in ways that few mortals have ever been tested. But for now, in these formative years, he was still learning, still growing, still preparing for the role he would one day claim. The Mediterranean world did not yet know his name, but it would. In time, every city, every legion, every corner of Rome's vast empire would learn to recognize the name Hannibal Barca and to fear it. Those years of preparation, of transformation, lay just ahead, and they would unfold in the sunlit, rugged, unforgiving landscape of Iberia. The land that greeted the young Hannibal was nothing like the harbours and markets of Carthage. Iberia stretched before him, vast, untamed, a patchwork of mountain ranges and river valleys that seemed to resist easy conquest. The sky was wider here, the air drier, and the people fiercer than any he had known. This was a frontier world, a place where Carthaginian power was not inherited but earned, day by patient day. The coastal plains gave way to rugged highlands where Iberian tribes lived according to their own ancient rhythms. Each tribe had its own dialect, its own gods, its own sense of honor. The Turdetani in the south had grown prosperous through trade and mining. The Lusitani in the west were warriors who measured wealth in cattle and glory in battle scars. The Celtiberians in the interior combined Celtic fierceness with Iberian cunning. To bring these peoples into Carthage's orbit required not just strength, but understanding. Hannibal's education in this world was patient and thorough. He learned to ride across terrain that would break lesser horsemen. He learned the languages, not perfectly, but enough to speak with tribal elders without an interpreter's filter. He learned which gifts carried weight, which promises could be trusted, and which chiefs ruled through fear rather than respect. In the evenings, when the campaign season slowed and the army made camp in river valleys, he listened to the veterans tell stories of past battles, past alliances, past betrayals. Under Hasdrubal the Fair, Carthage's grip on Iberia tightened without becoming a stranglehold. Hasdrubal had inherited Hamilcar's vision, but pursued it with a different temperament, more diplomat than warrior, more builder than conqueror. Where Hamilcar had led cavalry charges, Hasdrubal negotiated treaties. Where Hamilcar had burned rebellious villages, Hasdrubal married an Iberian princess and turned potential enemies into family. The city that would become the jewel of Carthaginian Iberia rose during these years on the southeastern coast. New Carthage, Cart Hadasht in Punic, Cartagena to later generations, was more than a settlement. It was a statement, built on a peninsula with natural harbours on both sides, protected by hills and accessible only through a narrow isthmus. It combined the defensive advantages of geography with the commercial opportunities of the sea. Its position allowed Carthage to receive supplies and reinforcements from Africa, while projecting power deep into the Iberian interior. Hannibal watched the city take shape stone by stone. He saw how Hasdrubal planned not just for conquest, but for permanence. Warehouses for storing grain and silver, docks for repairing ships, workshops where Iberian craftsmen learned Carthaginian techniques. The city became a hybrid place, where Punic merchants haggled in Greek with Iberian traders, where African soldiers married local women, where the gods of 3 continents received offerings in the same marketplace. But permanence is always fragile on a frontier. In 226 BC, Rome, watching Carthage's recovery with growing unease, negotiated a treaty with Hasdrubal. The terms were deceptively simple. The Ebro River would mark the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion in Iberia. South of the river, Carthage could do as it pleased. North of it lay territories Rome claimed as its sphere of influence. The agreement gave both powers what they needed. Rome, a buffer against Carthaginian ambition. Carthage, formal recognition of what it had already built. Hasdrubal accepted the treaty, understanding that ink on papyrus could serve Carthage as well as blood on soil. The Ebro became a line on maps, a diplomatic boundary that allowed Carthage to consolidate rather than expand. And for a time, that consolidation was enough. Silver from the mines around New Carthage flowed back to Africa, rebuilding the treasury that Rome had once emptied. Veterans settled on fertile land, becoming farmers who would also serve as reserves if war came again. The Iberian tribes, bound by treaties and marriages, supplied both tribute and soldiers. Through all of this, Hannibal learned. He was no longer a child watching his father work, but a young man beginning to shape policy himself. Hasdrubal recognized his ability and gave him responsibilities, leading expeditions against rebellious tribes, negotiating with local chiefs, managing the logistics that kept an army fed and equipped across hundreds of miles. The lessons were practical, unglamorous, essential. One lesson stood out above all others. Loyalty was the foundation of power. The Carthaginian army in Iberia was not a citizen militia like Rome's legions, but a professional force held together by pay, plunder, and personal bonds. The soldiers followed commanders they trusted, commanders who shared their hardships and remembered their names. Hannibal learned to visit the campfires at night, to ask after wounded men, to notice when a veteran's equipment was worn and needed replacing. These small gestures built something stronger than fear. They built devotion. He also learned from the Iberians themselves. Their cavalry was among the finest in the Mediterranean world, capable of swift maneuvers that heavier Greek and Italian horsemen could not match. Their infantry, though less disciplined than Carthaginian or Roman soldiers, fought with a ferocity born of defending their own hills and valleys. Hannibal studied their tactics, their weapons, their ways of moving across difficult terrain. He began to see war not as a clash of rigid formations, but as something more fluid, more adaptable. Marriage bound him to this land as well. He wed Emilce, a princess from the Iberian town of Castulo, a strategic city that controlled access to rich mining regions. The union was political, such marriages always were, but it also demonstrated Hannibal's commitment to the world his father had built. He was no longer simply a Carthaginian commander stationed in a distant province. He was becoming part of Iberia itself, a man with roots in two worlds. The death of Hasdrubal in 221 BC came suddenly, as violence often does. An assassin struck him down, a slave, some sources say, seeking revenge for a personal grievance. The murder was not part of any grand conspiracy, just the random cruelty that history sometimes delivers. But its consequences were anything but random. In the aftermath, the army gathered to choose its next commander. The soldiers, veterans who had served under Hamilcar and Hasdrubal, looked to the young man who had grown up among them. They remembered the boy who had arrived from Carthage with wide eyes and his father's name. They knew the man who now stood before them, tested in battle, fluent in their concerns, bearing the weight of the Barcid legacy. The acclamation was unanimous. Hannibal, at just 26 years old, became commander of all Carthaginian forces in Iberia. When word reached Carthage, the Senate debated briefly before confirming the army's choice. The Barcid faction remained powerful in the city's politics, and Hannibal's family name carried weight. But more than that, the Senate understood practical reality. The soldiers in Iberia would follow Hannibal whether Carthage approved or not. Better to ratify the decision and maintain the illusion of control than to provoke a crisis that might split the army. Hannibal's first actions as commander revealed the man he had become. He did not rush into grand campaigns or dramatic gestures. Instead, he spent months consolidating his position, confirming alliances with Iberian tribes, inspecting fortifications, and ensuring that the army's supply lines were secure. He understood what his father had taught him, that power built slowly was power that lasted. But he also understood something else, something that had shaped his entire life. The oath sworn in a Carthaginian temple when he was 9 years old. Rome had humbled Carthage once. Rome had taken Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Rome had imposed tribute and dictated terms. And Rome was watching, always watching, from across the sea. The treaty that limited Carthaginian expansion to the south of the Ebro had bought time, but time was running out. Hannibal knew that eventually, inevitably, Carthage and Rome would face each other again. The only questions were when, where, and under what circumstances. As he stood in New Carthage, looking out over the harbour, where ships rocked gently in the evening breeze, he could see the future taking shape. His father had rebuilt Carthaginian power in Iberia. Hasdrubal had given it structure and permanence. Now it fell to him to decide what to do with that power, whether to preserve it through caution or risk it for something greater. The mountains of Iberia stretched to the north and east, their peaks catching the last light of day. Beyond those mountains lay Gaul, and beyond Gaul, the Alps. And beyond the Alps, though the distance seemed impossible, though no army had ever attempted such a march, lay Italy itself. The sun set over New Carthage, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. In the growing darkness, the young commander turned away from the sea and walked back toward the city. The days of apprenticeship were over. The years of learning had ended. What came next would test everything his father had taught him, everything he had absorbed from this rugged frontier land, everything he believed about destiny and duty. The Mediterranean world did not yet know it, but the balance of power was shifting. In the hills of Iberia, far from the marble forums of Rome and the harbours of Carthage, a new kind of commander had emerged, one who understood both the discipline of civilization and the freedom of the frontier, both the patience of diplomacy and the necessity of war. The stage was set, the pieces were in position, and Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, commander of Carthage's armies, was ready to make his move. The first months of command are always a test. Soldiers watch to see if the new leader hesitates, if his orders carry conviction, if he understands the difference between authority given and authority earned. Hannibal faced this test not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet competence. He moved through the camps as his father had once done, speaking with veterans in their own dialects, inspecting equipment with an eye for detail that surprised even experienced officers. Within weeks, the army that had acclaimed him began to trust him. His early campaigns were calibrated exercises in controlled force. To the north and west of New Carthage lived tribes that had paid tribute to Hasdrubal, but now wondered if the young commander would demand the same respect. Hannibal answered their doubt not with speeches, but with action. He led expeditions into the territories of the Olcades, a people who lived in fortified hill towns, and raided Carthaginian settlements when they thought they could escape retaliation. The campaign unfolded with methodical precision. Hannibal did not charge forward recklessly, but moved his forces with care, securing supply lines, gathering intelligence from friendly tribes, and choosing his ground. When he reached the Alcade's principal stronghold, he surrounded it, cut off its water, and waited. The defenders, confident in their walls, believed they could outlast a siege. They were wrong. Carthaginian engineers, veterans of countless sieges across the Mediterranean world, brought forward their equipment: siege towers, battering rams, and platforms for archers. When the walls were breached, the town surrendered. Hannibal's treatment of the defeated revealed his strategy. He did not enslave the entire population or burn the settlement to ashes. Instead, he took hostages from the leading families, imposed a reasonable tribute, and left a small garrison to ensure compliance. The message was clear. Resistance brought suffering, but submission brought peace. Other Alcaides towns, watching what had happened, opened their gates without a fight. The following year, he turned his attention to the Vacaei, another tribe that controlled fertile lands and trade routes in the interior. Again, the pattern repeated: swift movement, careful planning, overwhelming force applied at the decisive moment. The Vacaei capital fell after a brief siege, and its wealth filled Carthaginian coffers. Veterans who had worried about their pay found their concerns answered with silver. Soldiers who had doubted the young commander's ability began to speak of him with the same respect they had once reserved for his father. But success bred complications. As Hannibal returned south with his spoils, he found his path blocked by the Carpetani, a powerful confederation alarmed by Carthaginian expansion so close to their own territories. They had gathered a large force, perhaps 40,000 warriors, and positioned themselves along the Tagus River, intending to catch the Carthaginian army as it crossed. The situation demanded more than courage. The Tagus was wide and swift, the enemy numerous and determined, and Hannibal's army burdened with loot and prisoners. A lesser commander might have sought another crossing or negotiated, but Hannibal saw opportunity in danger. He ordered his cavalry to cross first, forming a screen on the far bank. Then he sent his infantry into the water, arranged in columns that could support each other against the current. The Carpetani, watching the crossing, saw their moment and charged. But Hannibal had anticipated this. His cavalry, rather than fleeing, wheeled and struck the enemy's flanks, disrupting their formation. His infantry, half across the river and vulnerable, fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat was impossible. And on the near bank, his elephants, those great beasts that terrified enemies unfamiliar with them, waded into the shallows, their presence alone enough to create chaos among the tribal warriors. The battle was brief but decisive. The Carpetani broke and scattered, their confederation dissolving as quickly as it had formed. Hannibal's army crossed the Tagus intact, its reputation enhanced, its commander's tactical skill proven. Word of the victory spread across Iberia, carried by traders and travelers who spoke of the young Barcid with a mixture of awe and apprehension. These campaigns did more than secure territory. They transformed Hannibal's relationship with his soldiers. The men who marched under his standards were not conscripts serving a distant state, but professionals who had chosen to follow him. Many were Iberians, fighting for pay and the promise of land. Others were Numidians, light cavalry from North Africa, whose skill with javelin and horse made them invaluable. Still others were Libyans, heavy infantry trained in the Carthaginian style, or Greeks, mercenaries drawn by reputation and silver. What bound them together was not patriotism, but loyalty to their commander, a loyalty Hannibal cultivated with care. He made it a practice to share their hardships. When the army marched, he marched. When supplies ran short, he ate the same rations as his soldiers. When winter came and the campaign season ended, he did not retreat to comfortable quarters in New Carthage, but remained in the field, planning the next year's operations. His officers noticed that he rarely slept more than a few hours, that he could be found at any hour reviewing maps or consulting with scouts. His presence was constant, reassuring, and it created a bond that went beyond mere obedience. Meanwhile, his personal life took root in the Iberian soil. His marriage to Emilce produced a son, a child born into two worlds, Carthaginian by blood, Iberian by birth. The boy represented the future that Hannibal's father had envisioned. A Carthage reborn, its strength drawn not just from African harbours, but from the resources and peoples of the West. Yet even as Hannibal consolidated his position in Iberia, shadows lengthened from across the sea. In Rome, senators watched the young commander's successes with growing alarm. Carthage, they had believed, was a defeated power, humbled and contained. But the reports from Iberia told a different story, of armies growing stronger, of silver flowing from Spanish mines, of a general whose name was beginning to carry weight. The Treaty of the Ebro had been meant to limit Carthaginian expansion, but it had also, inadvertently, given Carthage room to rebuild. The city that would bring everything to a crisis sat south of the Ebro, technically within Carthaginian territory, but culturally and diplomatically aligned with Rome. Saguntum was a Greek settlement, prosperous and proud, perched on a hill overlooking the Mediterranean coast. Its people had long traded with Italian merchants and looked to Rome as a protector. When disputes arose between Saguntum and neighbouring Iberian tribes allied with Carthage, the city appealed to the Roman Senate for support. Rome responded with a warning. Saguntum was under Roman protection. Any attack on the city would be considered an act of war. The message was delivered to Carthage with the kind of certainty that assumed compliance. After all, Carthage had accepted humiliation before. Surely it would accept it again. But the world had changed. The Carthage that had sued for peace after the First Punic War had been led by exhausted oligarchs and merchants who calculated profit in terms of survival. The Carthage of 219 BC was represented by a young general who had grown up on stories of loss and betrayal, who commanded an army more loyal to him than to the Senate that nominally governed him, and who carried an oath sworn when he was 9 years old. Hannibal studied the situation with the same careful attention he brought to every campaign. Saguntum was a problem that could not be ignored. Its position on the coast threatened Carthaginian supply lines. Its alliance with Rome created a potential base for Roman operations south of the Ebro, and its defiance for the city had taken actions against Carthage's Iberian allies could not go unanswered without appearing weak. He sent envoys to Carthage, explaining the situation and seeking approval for action. The Senate's response was cautious but not prohibitive. They did not order him to attack Saguntum, but neither did they forbid it. The decision, effectively, was his to make. It was a test of his judgment, his nerve, and his understanding of the larger game being played across the Mediterranean. In the spring of 219 BC, Hannibal gathered his army and marched north along the coast. When his forces appeared before the walls of Saguntum, the city's inhabitants watched from their ramparts with a mixture of defiance and dread. They had hoped that Rome would send legions to defend them. They had trusted in the treaties that supposedly protected them. But the horizon remained empty of Roman sails, and the Carthaginian camp grew larger with each passing day. The siege of Saguntum would last 8 months, a grinding, bitter struggle that tested both attacker and defender. The city's walls were strong, its position naturally defensible, and its people determined. Hannibal could not simply overwhelm it with a sudden assault. Instead, he settled in for the patient, methodical work of breaking a city's will. Siege towers rose against the walls, battering rams pounded the gates. Archers exchanged volleys with defenders on the ramparts. Hannibal himself moved among the siege works, encouraging his engineers, consulting with his officers, and occasionally taking up a spear to fight beside his men. During one assault, he was wounded. A javelin struck his thigh. But he refused to abandon the siege, directing operations from a litter until he could walk again. Inside Saguntum, hope slowly turned to desperation. Food supplies dwindled. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals. Messengers sent to Rome returned with promises, but no legions. The city's leaders realized, too late, that they had been pawns in a larger game, and that Rome's protection was more rhetorical than real. As autumn turned to winter, the city's defenses finally crumbled. Carthaginian troops poured through breached walls, and the streets became battlegrounds. The fall of Saguntum was not gentle. Hannibal's soldiers, frustrated by months of siege and driven by the prospect of plunder, showed little mercy. The city that had defied them was made an example. When the smoke cleared and the looting ended, Saguntum was a Carthaginian possession. Its wealth, considerable for a trading city, was distributed among the victorious army. Its strategic position was secured, and its fall sent a clear message to every city and tribe in Iberia. Carthage was no longer a power that could be challenged with impunity. But the fall of Saguntum sent another message as well, one that echoed across the Mediterranean to Rome. In the Senate House, when news of the city's destruction arrived, there was outrage, disbelief, and then something colder: calculation. The young Barcid had crossed a line that Roman honor could not tolerate. Envoys were dispatched to Carthage with an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal for judgment or face war. The Carthaginian Senate, confronted with this choice, hesitated. Some counseled caution, remembering the cost of the last war with Rome. Others, emboldened by Hannibal's successes and stung by Roman arrogance, argued for defiance. The debate stretched across days, but in the end, pride and pragmatism aligned. Carthage would not hand over its most successful general. Carthage would not bow to Roman demands. If Rome wanted war, Rome would have it. When the Carthaginian response reached Rome, a refusal delivered with diplomatic courtesy but unmistakable firmness, the Senate voted for war. The Second Punic War had begun, not with a surprise attack or a border skirmish, but with a calculated choice made by both sides. Rome believed it would be a repeat of the first conflict. Armies sent to Spain, perhaps a landing in Africa, a few years of fighting, and then a peace that confirmed Roman supremacy. Carthage, or at least its Senate, hoped that a defensive war in Spain might convince Rome that dominance was too costly to maintain. But Hannibal, standing in the ruins of Saguntum, was thinking of neither defense nor repetition. He was thinking of the oath he had sworn as a child, of the lessons his father had taught him, of the army that trusted him and the silver that could finance them. He was thinking of maps he had studied in quiet hours, of mountain passes and river crossings, of the distance between New Carthage and Rome, not across the sea, but overland, through Gaul, through the Alps. He was thinking of the impossible, and he was preparing to make it real. Winter in New Carthage brought rain that drummed against tile roofs and turned the streets to mud. While storms swept in from the sea, Hannibal sat in lamplit rooms, with maps spread before him, tracing routes that no Carthaginian army had ever taken. His officers, summoned one by one to these quiet councils, listened as he described a plan so audacious that it seemed to belong to myth rather than strategy. Rome expected the war to be fought in Spain, perhaps in Africa. Roman fleets would control the sea as they had in the previous conflict, and Roman legions would march where Roman ships could supply them. This was the pattern of Mediterranean warfare, tested and reliable. But patterns, Hannibal understood, were vulnerabilities. If Rome expected him in one place, he would appear in another. If they controlled the sea, he would march by land. If they believed the Alps impassable for an army, he would cross them anyway. The decision was not made lightly. He consulted with his most trusted commanders, men who had served under his father, veterans who knew both the possibilities and costs of war. He sent scouts north into Gaul to map routes and negotiate with tribes. He calculated numbers. How many soldiers could make such a march? How much supplies they would need? How many horses and elephants could survive the journey? The logistics were staggering, the risks immense. But the alternative, a defensive war fought on Carthaginian territory, while Rome marshaled its superior resources, offered only slow defeat. As spring returned to Iberia in 218 BC, the army began to gather. From across the peninsula they came, Iberian tribesmen who had fought under Hannibal's command for years, Numidian cavalry whose light javelins and swift horses made them invaluable scouts, Libyan infantry trained in close formation fighting, and the war elephants, those magnificent, terrifying creatures that served as both weapon and symbol. Historians would later estimate the force at 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. It was not the largest army the ancient world had seen, but it was perhaps the most diverse, bound together by pay, loyalty, and the promise of plunder from the richest lands in the Mediterranean. Before departing, Hannibal made careful provisions for what he was leaving behind. He sent substantial forces back to Africa to defend Carthage itself, and he left his brother Hasdrubal in command of Iberia with enough troops to maintain control. The arrangement was pragmatic, but also revealed his understanding of politics. Success in Italy would mean nothing if Carthage fell or if Spain was lost while he was away. His entire strategy depended on maintaining multiple fronts, forcing Rome to divide its attention. To his wife, Emilce, and their young son, he said farewells that were private and unrecorded. What words passed between them remain unknown, lost to the discretion of history. But when he rode north from New Carthage in the late spring of 218 BC, he left behind more than a city. He left behind the possibility of a different life, one of consolidation rather than conquest, of building rather than risking everything on a single impossible campaign. The army moved up the coast, following roads that Hamilcar and Hasdrubal had built or improved over decades. The first major obstacle was the Ebro River, that boundary established by treaty, that line Rome had drawn to contain Carthaginian ambition. Hannibal crossed it without hesitation, and in that crossing, the treaty became meaningless. There would be no more negotiations, no more diplomatic posturing. The die, as another general would say centuries later, was cast. Beyond the Ebro lay territories that owed no allegiance to Carthage, tribes that were curious, suspicious, or openly hostile to this massive force moving through their lands. Some could be persuaded with gifts or promises. Others had to be subdued. Hannibal moved carefully, avoiding unnecessary battles, but not shying from them when needed. Each delay cost time, and time was a resource as precious as food or water. The Roman legions would not wait patiently in Italy while he negotiated his way across Gaul. The Pyrenees rose before them, that formidable range separating Iberia from Gaul. The passes were steep, the trails narrow, and the local tribes accustomed to ambushing travelers. But Hannibal's scouts had mapped the routes, and his soldiers, many of them from Iberia's own mountains, knew how to move through high country. The crossing was difficult, but not catastrophic. On the far side, in what the Romans called Gaul, the landscape opened into river valleys and plains that stretched toward the distant Alps. Gaul was not empty wilderness, but a patchwork of Celtic tribes, each with its own territory, alliances, and grievances. Some saw the Carthaginian army as an opportunity, a force that might help them against their rivals or against Roman influence creeping up from the south. Others saw only danger, a massive foreign army demanding passage and supplies. Hannibal's diplomacy was tested again and again. He met with tribal chiefs, offered gifts of Spanish silver, and made promises about shared enemies. Rome, he reminded them, was expanding northward. Rome took land and called it civilization. Rome made allies into subjects. The message resonated with some. Rome had been pushing into southern Gaul for decades, establishing colonies and treaties that served Roman interests. The Celtic tribes had watched their southern neighbors become clients of Rome, had seen their trade routes controlled and their autonomy eroded. If this Carthaginian general was Rome's enemy, then perhaps he could be their ally, or at least a useful tool in their own struggles. But not all Gauls were convinced. Some tribes, especially those allied with Rome, or simply protective of their lands, mustered warriors to block the Carthaginian advance. Near the Rhone River, one such confrontation seemed inevitable. The river was wide and swift, its far bank lined with thousands of hostile warriors ready to slaughter any force attempting to cross. Hannibal studied the problem with his characteristic patience. A direct assault across the river would be costly, perhaps impossible. Instead, he sent a strong detachment upstream under cover of darkness to find a narrower crossing. While the enemy warriors concentrated on the main Carthaginian camp, this flanking force crossed unseen, marched downstream, and prepared to strike the defenders from behind. The next morning, as Hannibal's army began its crossing, soldiers on rafts and makeshift boats, horses swimming beside them, elephants wading through the shallows, the Gallic warriors surged forward to contest the landing. But then, from behind them, came the crash of the flanking force. Caught between two enemies, their formation broken, the defenders scattered. The crossing was secured. The elephants proved their worth in that moment, not through combat, but through spectacle. The Celtic warriors, who had never seen such creatures, recoiled in confusion and fear. Stories would spread through Gaul of the great beasts the Carthaginian commanded, creatures that seemed to belong to legend rather than war. The psychological impact was as valuable as any tactical advantage. Beyond the Rhone, the path turned eastward toward the Alps. Roman scouts had by now reported Hannibal's movements, and in Rome itself, the Senate scrambled to adjust its strategy. They had sent one army to Spain, expecting to fight Hannibal there. Another was being prepared to invade Africa. But now their enemy was approaching Italy by a route they had not imagined possible. Orders were sent to redirect forces, but armies moved slowly, and news moved slower still. As autumn approached, the first snows dusted the high peaks ahead. The Alps rose like a wall against the sky, their scale dwarfing anything the soldiers from Africa and Spain had ever seen. The passes through them were known to local traders and Celtic tribes who migrated seasonally. But for an army, with elephants, with baggage trains, with thousands of men who had never experienced mountain cold, The crossing would be unlike anything attempted before. Hannibal gathered his officers and explained what lay ahead. There was no inspiring speech recorded, no dramatic oration. Instead, there was the quiet certainty of a commander who had calculated the odds and decided that the impossible was merely difficult. They would cross the mountains. They would lose men to cold, to falls, to exhaustion. But they would emerge on the other side in Italy, and Rome would face an enemy where it least expected one. The soldiers, hearing this, must have felt something between dread and exhilaration. They had followed Hannibal across rivers and through hostile territories. They had trusted his judgment at Saguntum, at the Ebro, at the Rhone. Now he asked them to trust him through the mountains, through the snow, through a passage that might kill them as surely as any Roman legion. They followed. The ascent began in late autumn, when the mountain passes were barely passable. Local guides, hired or coerced from the Gallic tribes, led the way along narrow trails that clung to cliff faces. The army moved in a long, vulnerable column, strung out across miles of mountain terrain. In some places, the path was so narrow that wagons had to be abandoned and supplies carried by hand or on the backs of pack animals. The local tribes, watching from the heights, saw opportunity in vulnerability. Ambushes came without warning. Boulders rolled down slopes. Arrows shot from hidden positions. Sudden attacks on the column's flanks. Hannibal's soldiers, trained for open battle, struggled to fight in this vertical terrain. But they adapted, learning to send scouts ahead, to secure high ground before the main column advanced, to move quickly through the most dangerous passages. The cold was worse than the ambushes. Soldiers from North Africa and Iberia, accustomed to Mediterranean warmth, now marched through snow and ice. Their equipment, designed for lowland warfare, offered little protection against the wind that cut through the passes. Horses slipped on icy trails and fell, screaming, into ravines. Men developed frostbite, their fingers and toes blackening in the thin mountain air. At night, they huddled around fires that could barely be lit, sharing what warmth they could. The elephants suffered too. These massive creatures, brought from the forests of North Africa, were adapted for heat and plains, not for narrow mountain trails and freezing temperatures. Their handlers, the mahouts who had cared for them since birth, coaxed them forward step by careful step. Some of the great beasts succumbed to the cold or to falls, their bodies left behind in the snow as grim markers of the army's passage. Yet through all this, the army moved forward. Hannibal was everywhere, walking with the soldiers, encouraging the pack animals, consulting with guides about the route ahead. His presence became a kind of talisman. If their commander could endure this, then so could they. The descent was in some ways worse than the climb. The trails on the Italian side were steeper, more treacherous. In one place, a landslide had blocked the path entirely, and the army was forced to halt while engineers carved a new route through the rock. The delay lasted days, precious time when supplies dwindled and the soldiers' endurance frayed. But finally, gradually, the mountains released them. The passes gave way to foothills, the foothills to valleys, and the valleys to the Po River plain. Below them stretched Italy, green, fertile, and utterly unprepared for what was descending from the Alps. Of the 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry that had left New Carthage, perhaps half survived the journey. The elephants, once 37, were reduced to fewer than a dozen. The army that emerged from the Alps was smaller, exhausted, frostbitten, and hungry. But it had done what Rome believed impossible. It had crossed the mountains and brought war to Italy itself. Hannibal, looking out over the Po Valley, from the last of the mountain passes, saw before him the heartland of Rome's power. The cities of northern Italy, the farmlands that fed the legions, the roads that connected the Republic, all of this lay within reach. He had brought his army across the Mediterranean world, through hostile tribes and impossible mountains, sustained by logistics and will. The soldiers who stood with him on that height, gazing down at the Italian plains, understood that they had become part of something extraordinary. The march itself would be remembered long after the battles to come. They had followed their commander across the roof of the world, and they had survived. Rome, preparing for war in Spain and Africa, now learned that war had come to them. The city that had never been conquered, that had built its empire through discipline and strategy, would now face an enemy who understood both. And that enemy had just completed a march that would echo through military history for millennia. The descent continued. Behind them, the Alps stood white and silent. Ahead, the valley opened like an invitation. Hannibal's war had begun. The Po Valley, in late autumn, was a landscape of mist and memory. Rivers threaded through plains where Celtic tribes had settled generations before. Their villages a patchwork of alliance and rivalry that Rome had only recently begun to control. The local Gauls, the Insubres, the Boiae, the Cenomani, watched the mountains and waited. Rumors had reached them of an army descending from the passes, led by a general who promised to break Rome's growing dominance over their lands. When Hannibal's soldiers emerged from the foothills, battered and half-starved, the Gallic chiefs came to see for themselves. What they found was not the gleaming army of legend, but something more impressive. Exhausted men who had survived what should have killed them, a commander who had led them through the impossible. The Celtic warriors, themselves no strangers to hardship, recognized strength when they saw it. The alliance formed quickly. The Gauls provided food, fresh horses, and thousands of warriors eager to strike back at Rome. Hannibal, in return, offered them what they wanted most: a chance to reclaim their independence, to drive Roman colonists from their lands, to restore the balance that had existed before the legions came north. The partnership was practical rather than sentimental, bound by mutual interest rather than trust. But it was enough. While his soldiers rested and recovered, Hannibal sent messengers throughout the region, announcing his arrival and his purpose. He had not come to conquer Gaul, but to liberate it. He had not come to enslave Italy, but to humble Rome. The message was calculated to divide his enemies, to encourage Rome's allies to reconsider their loyalty, to plant doubt in the minds of those who had submitted to Roman power. In Rome itself, the news brought confusion before it brought action. The Senate had dispatched Publius Cornelius Scipio, father to the man who would one day defeat Hannibal, to intercept the Carthaginian army in Gaul. But Scipio had arrived too late. By the time his forces reached the Rhonen, Hannibal was already in the mountains. Now, forced to adapt, Scipio sent most of his army onward to Spain, while he himself returned to northern Italy by sea, hoping to gather the legions stationed there and face Hannibal, before the Carthaginian could fully recover from the Alpine crossing. The two commanders would meet sooner than either expected. Near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po, Scipio's forces encountered Hannibal's cavalry screen. What followed was not a great battle, but a sharp, revealing skirmish, a clash of mounted troops that tested the quality and resolve of both sides. The Roman cavalry, heavily armored and trained for disciplined charges, advanced with confidence, but they faced an enemy unlike any they had fought before. The Numidian light cavalry, darting forward and back with javelins, harassed the Roman flanks. The Spanish horsemen, veterans of years of frontier warfare, struck with precision, and behind them, directing the flow of battle with quiet signals, rode Hannibal himself, leading from the front as he always did. The engagement turned against Rome quickly. Scipio, personally leading his cavalry, was wounded. A spear or javelin caught him, and he would have died there if not for his teenage son, who rode forward and dragged his father to safety. The Roman line broke, and the cavalry retreated in disorder. It was a small defeat measured in numbers, but its implications were vast. Rome's soldiers, encountering this strange foreign army for the first time, had learned that they were facing something more dangerous than rumor. Scipio withdrew south, seeking defensible ground and reinforcements. His wound pained him, and his army's morale had been shaken. Word of the skirmish spread through the region, and with it came a shift in perception. The Gauls who had hesitated now flocked to Hannibal's standards. The Roman colonists who had settled in the Po Valley began to abandon their farms and flee south. The psychological balance, so carefully maintained by Roman prestige, was beginning to tilt. Winter was approaching, and a lesser commander might have halted, allowing his exhausted army to rest through the cold months. But Hannibal understood momentum. He had not crossed the Alps to wait. He had come to strike Rome while it was unprepared, to shatter the myth of Roman invincibility before the legions could fully mobilize. The Senate, alarmed by Scipio's retreat, ordered another army north under the command of Sempronius Longus, a consul eager for glory and confident in Roman superiority. Sempronius brought with him legions fresh and well supplied, their ranks filled with citizens who had trained for war but never experienced it. He joined forces with the wounded Scipio near the Trebia River, and together they commanded a force that outnumbered Hannibal's weakened army. But numbers alone had never determined Hannibal's strategy. What mattered was terrain, timing, and the psychology of the enemy commander. Sempronius was impetuous, hungry for a decisive victory that would redeem Roman pride. Hannibal recognized this, and he designed a trap that would exploit both the consul's ambition and the winter morning's cold. On a December dawn, when frost covered the ground and the Trebia River ran icy and swift, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the river to provoke the Roman camp. They harassed the sentries, hurled javelins, and withdrew, just enough to sting Roman pride, just enough to anger the consul who watched from his tent. Sempronius, against Scipio's cautious advice, ordered his army forward. The soldiers, roused from sleep and given no time to eat, marched through the cold pre-dawn darkness and waded into the freezing river. The water reached their waists, soaking their clothing and numbing their limbs. On the far bank, they formed their lines and advanced toward what they believed was Hannibal's main force arrayed across the plain. But Hannibal had prepared the field with care. While the Roman legions advanced, exhausted and cold, his own troops, well-fed, rested, and positioned since before dawn, waited in formation. And hidden in a gully to the side, concealed by the morning mist and the rough terrain, his brother Mago waited with 2,000 picked men, infantry and cavalry trained to strike at the perfect moment. The battle unfolded as Hannibal had envisioned. The Roman center pressed forward with their characteristic discipline, driving back the Carthaginian infantry before them. For a moment, it seemed that Roman valor might triumph over Carthaginian cunning. But then Hannibal's cavalry swept around the Roman flanks, driving off the less experienced Roman horsemen. And from the hidden gully, Mago's force erupted, crashing into the Roman rear. The legions, caught between converging enemies, fought with desperation. Some units held their formation and cut their way through to safety. Others broke and scattered, pursued by Numidian cavalry across the frozen fields. The Trebia River, which they had crossed so confidently that morning, now became an obstacle of death. Exhausted men, weighed down by armor, drowned in the icy current or collapsed on the far bank, too cold to continue. Of the 40,000 Romans who had crossed the Trebia that morning, perhaps half made it back to their camp. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across the Italian countryside. Sempronius had achieved his decisive battle, but not the victory he craved. And Rome, receiving news of the disaster, began to understand that this war would not be won by confidence alone. Through the winter months that followed, Hannibal moved carefully through northern Italy. He did not have the strength to assault fortified cities or to confront the full might of Rome's military if it could be properly mobilized. Instead, he focused on maintaining his army, recruiting from the Gallic tribes, and preparing for the campaign season that would come with spring. His soldiers, though victorious, were far from home, surrounded by enemies, and entirely dependent on what they could obtain from the land or through alliance. The wound Hannibal had sustained at the Ticinus, or perhaps an infection developed during the Alpine crossing, now manifested in a new affliction. His eye, irritated by the cold and damp of the Po Valley winter, became painfully inflamed. The condition worsened despite the efforts of his physicians, and eventually he lost sight in one eye entirely. The injury was never mentioned in his dispatches, never used as an excuse for delay, but it marked him a visible reminder that even commanders bleed, that even victories carry costs. Yet this physical limitation did not diminish his effectiveness. If anything, the soldiers who saw their general endure pain without complaint became even more devoted to him. He adapted to the loss of depth perception with the same pragmatism he brought to every challenge, continuing to lead from the front, continuing to study terrain and enemy movements with his characteristic attention to detail. As winter gave way to early spring, the landscape remained hushed as though holding its breath. The Romans, shaken by their defeats but far from broken, were gathering new legions. The Carthaginians, victorious but isolated, were preparing for a campaign whose outcome remained uncertain. Between the two armies lay Italy, its cities anxious, its farmers caught between warring powers, its future balanced on the edge of a season that would bring bloodshed beyond anything yet seen. In Rome, the traditional celebrations of the new year were muted. The Senate appointed new consuls, raised fresh troops, and debated strategy long into the night. Some argued for caution, for a defensive strategy that would wear down the invader through attrition. Others demanded immediate vengeance, another decisive battle that would redeem Roman honor. The debates revealed a republic at war with itself as much as with Carthage, divided between fear and pride, between wisdom and the need to appear strong. Hannibal, encamped in the territory of his Gallic allies, received intelligence about these debates through deserters and spies. He understood Roman psychology perhaps better than Rome understood itself. The Republic could not tolerate the presence of a foreign army on Italian soil. It could not allow its allies to question Roman protection. Sooner or later, regardless of wisdom or caution, Rome would send another army to face him. And when it did, he would be ready. The winter encampment slowly emptied as spring warmth returned to the valleys. Soldiers who had spent months in enforced idleness prepared their weapons and checked their equipment. The Gallic warriors who had joined the Carthaginian cause sharpened their longswords and painted their shields. The Numidian cavalry exercised their horses in the fields, practicing the wheeling charges that had broken Roman lines at the Trebia. And Hannibal, standing at the edge of his camp, looking south toward the heart of Italy, planned his next move. He had announced his arrival with victories, but victories alone would not defeat Rome. The Republic was vast, its resources deep, its capacity for endurance legendary. To truly threaten Rome, he would need to do more than win battles. He would need to shatter the alliance system that gave Rome its strength, convince Italy's cities and tribes that Roman protection was an illusion, demonstrate that the Republic could not defend those who trusted it. The strategy was clear in his mind, refined through years of study and experience. He would march south, drawing the Roman armies after him. He would choose the ground for battle, not allow it to be chosen for him. And he would win, not through superior numbers, for Rome's reserves were far greater than his, but through superior generalship, through the kind of tactical brilliance that turned enemy strength into vulnerability. The Po Valley, where he had won his first victories in Italy, was about to be left behind. The real campaign, the one that would determine the fate of nations, was just beginning. Ahead lay the Apennines, the spine of Italy, and beyond them, the fertile lands of Etruria and Latium. Somewhere in that landscape, Roman armies were forming. Commanders were being appointed, and strategies were being debated. The clash, when it came, would be remembered not as a skirmish or an encounter, but as something far more significant. The general who had crossed the Alps, who had led his army through what should have been impossible, was about to demonstrate that the impossible was merely the beginning. The spring winds carried the scent of new grass and distant rain. The army gathered its supplies and prepared to march. And in the quiet, before movement, before the next great spring arrived in Italy, the kind of brightness what this foreign commander would do next. Possible. The fields turned green, the roads dried, and the armies began to move. Hannibal, having spent the winter consolidating his position in the north, now turned his gaze southward. Between him and Rome's heartland lay the Apennines, that spine of mountains running down the length of Italy, and beyond them the rich agricultural lands of Etruria that fed the Republic's growing power. The route he chose was characteristically bold. Rather than taking the longer but easier coastal road, he led his army through the marshes of the Arno River Valley, a landscape of standing water and treacherous footing that would exhaust his troops but allow him to bypass Roman defensive positions. For 4 days and 3 nights, the army marched through water that sometimes reached their waists, through mud that sucked at their feet, through air thick with marsh fever and biting insects. The soldiers endured because they had already endured so much. The Alps had taught them that their commander would share their suffering, that he would not ask of them what he would not bear himself. Hannibal rode at the front of the column, seated on the last surviving elephant, his one good eye scanning the sodden landscape ahead, while the other, still inflamed and painful, remained closed against the damp air. The cost of the marsh crossing was paid in sickness and exhaustion. Men collapsed from fever. Horses stumbled and could not rise. And Hannibal's afflicted eye, aggravated by the damp and lack of rest, worsened until the infection could no longer be ignored. By the time the army emerged from the marshes into the sunlit hills of Etruria, he had lost his sight in that eye entirely. Yet he made no show of the loss, gave no indication that it affected his command. The soldiers, noticing his silence on the matter, understood that complaint was a luxury none of them could afford. The appearance of a Carthaginian army in Etruria sent tremors through Roman strategy. The Senate had appointed Gaius Flaminius as consul, a popular leader known more for his boldness than his caution. He commanded a fresh army positioned to defend the approaches to Rome, and when news reached him that Hannibal had bypassed his defenses and was now ravaging the Etruscan countryside. His response was immediate and predictable. Flaminius marched his legions in pursuit, determined to bring the invader to battle and restore Roman honor. His officers counseled patience. Wait for the other consul's army to arrive, they urged, and face Hannibal with combined strength. But patience was difficult when smoke rose from Etruscan farms, when refugees fled south with tales of Carthaginian plunder, when every day of delay seemed to mock Roman power. Flaminius ordered the pursuit to continue. Hannibal, aware that he was being followed, chose his ground with the precision of an artist selecting a canvas. Near the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, the road ran through a narrow valley, squeezed between the water and steep, forested hills. It was a landscape that favored ambush over open battle, concealment over display. Here he would not fight with the advantage of numbers, for the Romans still outnumbered him, but with the advantage of surprise. On the night before the battle, Hannibal positioned his troops with care. The heavy infantry, his Libyan and Spanish veterans, he placed at the far end of the valley, where they would be visible to the approaching Romans, a louche, an apparent target for Roman aggression. Along the wooded hillsides overlooking the road, he stationed his light infantry and Gallic warriors, ordering them to remain hidden until the signal came. The cavalry, both Numidian and Spanish, took positions at the valley's entrance, ready to close the trap once the Romans had committed. Dawn broke over Lake Trasimene, with a thick morning mist rising from the water, obscuring the hillsides and reducing visibility to a few dozen paces. It was the kind of weather that makes armies nervous, that turns confidence into caution. But Flaminius, eager to catch the enemy he had pursued for days, ordered his legions forward into the valley without waiting for the mist to clear, without sending scouts to probe the heights. The Roman vanguard marched along the lakeshore, their formation stretched into a long column by the narrow road. Behind them came rank after rank of legionaries, perhaps 15,000 men in all, their armor clinking, their standards raised, their minds focused on the Carthaginian force they believed waited ahead. They did not see the thousands of warriors crouched silent in the mist above them. Hannibal waited until the Roman column had fully entered the valley, until the entrance was far behind them, and the visible Carthaginian force tantalizingly close ahead. Then, from his position on the hillside, he gave the signal. The attack came from all sides at once. From the wooded slopes poured Gallic warriors and light infantry, crashing into the Roman flanks with javelins and swords. From the rear, cavalry blocked the entrance to the valley, cutting off any hope of retreat. And from ahead, the heavy infantry advanced in disciplined formation, pressing the Roman vanguard back against the lake. Chaos spread faster than orders could be given. The Roman column, stretched out along the narrow road, could not properly deploy into battle formation. Units tried to face uphill toward their attackers, but the steep slopes and thick vegetation made formation impossible. The mist, which had seemed merely inconvenient moments before, now became a weapon against them. They could not see the full scale of the disaster, could not coordinate with units 100 paces away, could not find their commanders in the confusion. Flaminius, realizing too late what had happened, tried to rally his men around his standard. But in the press of battle, in the confusion of mist and forest and panicked soldiers, he was cut down by a Gallic warrior who may not have even known whom he had killed. His death went unnoticed by most of his army, learned only later when the fighting stopped and the casualties were counted. The battle, if it could even be called that, rather than a massacre, lasted perhaps 3 hours. By the time the mist cleared and the sun broke through to illuminate the lake, The shore was littered with Roman dead. Some soldiers, driven into the water, drowned in their armor. Others, surrounded and outnumbered, threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. A few units, perhaps 6,000 men, managed to cut their way through the encirclement and escape, fleeing south to bring news of the catastrophe to Rome. Of the 15,000 Romans who had entered the valley that morning, fewer than half survived. The lake, reflecting the clear spring sky, lapped against armor and shields that would rust there for generations. Lake Trasimene had witnessed one of the most complete ambushes in military history, a battle won not through superior numbers, but through superior understanding of terrain, timing, and the enemy's psychology. In Rome, the news brought something close to panic. 2 major armies defeated in less than a year, 2 consuls either killed or humiliated. And still, the Carthaginian commander marched through Italy, apparently unstoppable, his army growing stronger as Roman allies began to waver in their loyalty. The Senate, desperate for stability, appointed a dictator, an extraordinary office used only in times of supreme crisis. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus, a leader known not for boldness but for patience, not for seeking glory but for avoiding disaster. His strategy would be remembered by his nickname, Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius understood what others had failed to grasp. Hannibal could not be defeated by meeting him in open battle. The Carthaginian was simply too skilled, too experienced, too capable of turning Roman strength into vulnerability. Instead, Fabius proposed a strategy of exhaustion. He would shadow Hannibal's movements without engaging him directly. He would harass supply lines, cut off foragers, prevent the Carthaginian army from resting or gathering provisions. He would turn Italy itself into a weapon, using time and attrition to weaken an enemy that could not be beaten by the sword. The strategy infuriated many Romans. It seemed cowardly, passive, an admission of weakness. Officers complained that they were playing the role of spectators, while barbarians ravaged their homeland. Soldiers grumbled that they had been trained to fight, not to watch. And in the forum, politicians denounced Fabius as a coward who lacked the courage to defend Rome's honor. But Fabius endured the criticism with the same patience he brought to strategy. He knew that his approach was working, slowly, almost invisibly, but working nonetheless. Hannibal's army, unable to rest, unable to accumulate supplies, began to show signs of strain. Desertions increased. Gallic allies, frustrated by the lack of plunder and decisive victories, began to drift away. The Carthaginian force that had seemed unstoppable after Trasimene now appeared mortal, finite, vulnerable to the slow erosion of time. Yet patience is a difficult virtue to maintain in politics. As Fabius's 6-month term as dictator ended, popular pressure forced the Senate to return to a more aggressive strategy. New consuls were elected, and new armies were raised. This time, the largest Rome had ever assembled. If Hannibal could not be avoided, then he would be crushed by sheer weight of numbers. The new strategy would be tested in the plains of southern Italy, near a small town called Cannae. There, in the summer of 216 BC, Rome would stake everything on one enormous gamble, a battle so large, so decisive, that its outcome would determine whether the Republic survived or fell. Hannibal, having spent months avoiding Fabius's patient pursuit, now had what he wanted. Another Roman army seeking battle, another opportunity to demonstrate that Roman discipline could be overcome by Carthaginian genius. He positioned his forces near Cannae, on ground that appeared to favor the Romans' numerical advantage, and waited for them to arrive. The stage was set, the armies gathered, and the summer sun beat down on the plains where history would turn. The Roman legions, perhaps 80,000 strong, marched with confidence born of numbers. They had learned from previous defeats, strengthened their formations, drilled their soldiers in the tactics that had built an empire. Surely, they believed, no army could stand against such overwhelming force. But Hannibal, studying the approaching legions from his position across the field, saw not strength, but predictability. He saw an enemy that believed in formations, in discipline, in the straightforward application of power. And he saw an opportunity to turn that belief into disaster. As the armies took their positions on the plain, as commanders gave final instructions and soldiers checked their weapons, the air itself seemed to pause. The Battle of Cannae, though yet unfought, had already been won in the mind of a man who had learned to see warfare, not as a clash of strength, but as a problem of geometry, psychology, and will. The crescendo of Hannibal's Italian campaign was about to reach its peak. What followed would echo through military academies and battlefields for 2,000 years, studied and marveled at by every commander who sought to understand the art of war at its highest expression. But that story, the story of the double envelopment, of the crescent that became a noose, of the day when Rome lost more soldiers than any other battle in its history, was still hours away. For now there was only the waiting, the heat, and the gathering certainty that what happened next would change the world. The plain at Cannae stretched flat and featureless under the August sun, a landscape that seemed designed for the kind of warfare Rome understood best, massed formations meeting head-on, discipline prevailing over cleverness, strength overwhelming skill. The Roman consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, commanded the largest army the Republic had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, drawn from every corner of Italy and beyond. Against them stood Hannibal's 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, outnumbered nearly 2-1, but positioned with the quiet confidence of a commander who had chosen this ground for a reason. The battle began in the early morning, as battles often did, with skirmishes between light troops testing the enemy's resolve. Then the main lines advanced. The Roman infantry, arranged in their traditional dense formation, pressed forward like a great hammer, seeking to crush everything before it. And at first, it seemed to work. The Carthaginian center, composed of Gallic and Spanish troops, began to bend backward under the pressure, their line forming a convex curve that bulged toward the rear. Roman officers, watching this development, must have felt vindication. Their numbers were telling. Their discipline was prevailing. Victory seemed within reach. Just a matter of time before the enemy center broke entirely. But the bending line did not break. It flexed and gave ground, yes, but it maintained cohesion, drawing the Roman legions deeper into engagement, pulling them forward into a narrowing space. And while the Roman center pressed ahead, focused on the enemy before them, the flanks began to collapse. Hannibal's cavalry, both Numidian and Spanish, superior in skill and commanded with precision, swept around the Roman wings, drove off the overmatched Roman horsemen, and then wheeled inward. At the same moment, the Carthaginian heavy infantry positioned on the flanks. Hannibal's Libyan veterans, who had stood firm while the center gave ground, turned inward as well. The crescent that had bent backward now became a noose, tightening from all sides. The Roman legions, packed dense in pursuit of what they thought was a retreating enemy, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Cavalry pressed from behind, infantry from the sides, and still the reformed Carthaginian center held them from the front. The space that had seemed so open moments before became a killing ground where numbers turned from advantage to liability. Soldiers could not raise their swords for the press of bodies. Officers could not issue orders over the screams and confusion. The disciplined formations that were Rome's pride dissolved into a mass of trapped men fighting for survival. The slaughter continued through the long afternoon. Some units fought to the end with the stubborn courage that had built an empire. Others tried to surrender, only to find that in such chaos, mercy was impossible to give or receive. By evening, when the killing finally stopped and the exhausted Carthaginian soldiers could no longer lift their arms, the field was carpeted with Roman dead. The estimates vary, as they always do with ancient battles, but the numbers remain staggering. Perhaps 50,000 Roman soldiers died at Cannae, more than Rome had lost in any single day in its history, more than would die in many of its wars. Among the dead was the consul Aemilius Paulus, the better general of the two, who had opposed giving battle, but had been overruled by his colleague and political necessity. The other consul, Varro, survived only because he had commanded the cavalry wing and managed to escape when it broke. The tactical brilliance of Cannae would be studied by military commanders for millennia. The double envelopment, the deliberate weakening of the center to draw in the enemy, the perfect coordination of cavalry and infantry, all of it represented warfare elevated to art. But in the immediate aftermath, what mattered was not the elegance of the victory, but its consequences. Hannibal stood on the blood-soaked field as the sun set, surveying what his genius had wrought. His officers, exhilarated by the magnitude of the triumph, urged him to march on Rome immediately. The city lay less than 200 miles to the north, its defenses depleted, its population terrified. One bold stroke, they argued, and the war could be ended. But Hannibal, exhausted and pragmatic, understood what his cavalry commander Hannibal did not. Taking Rome, a fortified city of hundreds of thousands, supplied by sea and defended by walls built to withstand siege, required not just soldiers, but siege equipment, supplies for a long investment, and reinforcements to replace the inevitable casualties. His army, though victorious, was still far from home, still dependent on what it could gather from the Italian countryside. "You know how to win a battle, Hannibal," Hannibal is said to have remarked bitterly, "but you do not know how to use a victory." Whether or not those words were actually spoken, they captured a truth that would define the rest of the war. Cannae had been a tactical masterpiece, but it had not, could not, end the conflict. Rome, faced with its greatest disaster, did what Rome did best. It endured. In the city, when the news arrived, there was grief and shock, but not surrender. The Senate met in emergency session, declared public mourning, and then got to work. New legions were raised, this time including men previously considered too poor or too young to serve. Slaves were offered freedom in exchange for military service. Alliances were reaffirmed with wavering cities. The machinery of state, tested by catastrophe, proved resilient enough to continue functioning. And crucially, Rome refused to negotiate. When Hannibal sent envoys offering terms, reasonable terms, by the standards of ancient warfare, the Senate refused even to receive them. There would be no peace while a foreign army remained on Italian soil. There would be no acknowledgement of defeat. The Republic would fight, and if necessary, it would die fighting. This Roman stubbornness was Hannibal's greatest obstacle. He had won every major battle, defeated every army sent against him, demonstrated beyond doubt his superiority as a commander. But he could not force Rome to accept the reality that its military leadership could not grasp, and without that acceptance, without peace or surrender. He was trapped in a war of attrition he could not win. In the months and years that followed Cannae, the nature of the conflict shifted. Hannibal marched through southern Italy, and several important cities defected to his side. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to him, providing a base of operations and a propaganda victory. Syracuse in Sicily, after the death of its king, allied with Carthage, opening a new front. For a moment, it seemed that Rome's alliance system, the network of treaties and dependencies that had given it control over Italy, might unravel entirely. But Rome adapted. Rather than meet Hannibal in open battle, Roman commanders returned to the Fabian strategy of harassment and delay. They shadowed his movements, cut off his foragers, recaptured cities that had defected. When Hannibal moved to relieve an allied city, they moved away. When he marched elsewhere, they besieged the places he had left behind. It was unglamorous warfare, frustrating for both sides, but it worked. The siege of Capua became a turning point. In 211 BC, Roman forces surrounded the city, determined to recapture it and punish its betrayal. Hannibal, attempting to relieve the siege, tried the old strategy of threatening Rome itself. He marched his army to within 3 miles of the city walls, hoping to panic the besiegers into abandoning Capua and rushing back to defend the capital. But Rome had learned. The Senate ordered the siege of Capua to continue, refusing to be drawn away by the threat to the city itself. The message was clear. Rome would sacrifice even its own capital before it would let Hannibal dictate strategy. When Hannibal realized the gambit had failed, he withdrew. Capua, abandoned, eventually surrendered to Rome. Its punishment was severe, its leaders executed, its citizens enslaved or dispersed, its status as an independent city erased. The recapture of Capua marked the beginning of a slow erosion of Hannibal's position. One by one, the Italian cities that had allied with him returned to Roman control, some through negotiation, others through conquest. His Gallic allies, frustrated by years of inconclusive warfare and diminishing prospects of plunder, began to drift away. His supplies, always precarious, became even more uncertain as Roman control tightened around him. He needed reinforcements from Carthage, but Carthage was fighting its own wars in Spain and Africa, stretched thin by conflicts on multiple fronts. The silver mines that had financed Carthaginian power were under attack by Roman forces under the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same boy who had saved his father at the Ticinus, now grown into a commander of his own. In 207 BC, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, who had been commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain, attempted to repeat Hannibal's Alpine crossing. He gathered an army, marched through Gaul, crossed the mountains, and entered Italy from the north. If he could join forces with his brother, the combined Carthaginian army might finally have the strength to threaten Rome directly. But Roman intelligence was better than it had been 9 years before. Intercepted messages revealed Hasdrubal's plans and route. Roman forces, under the command of several generals, moved to intercept him before he could march south. At the Metaurus River in northern Italy, they caught him. The Battle of the Metaurus was decisive not for its tactical brilliance. It was a straightforward engagement, but for its consequences. Hasdrubal, surrounded and outnumbered, fought with desperate courage, but was killed in the fighting. His army was scattered or destroyed, and the reinforcements Hannibal had desperately needed would never arrive. The news reached Hannibal in the south in the cruelest way possible. Roman soldiers threw Hasdrubal's severed head into the Carthaginian camp, a message that required no translation. Hannibal, seeing his brother's face, understood that the war was lost. He had not been defeated in battle, but he had been defeated by logistics, by Rome's deeper reserves, by the simple arithmetic of resources and time. For the next several years, he remained in southern Italy, holding a shrinking territory around Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot. His army, though still undefeated in direct combat, was isolated, undersupplied, and slowly withering. He could not advance, but he would not surrender. It was a strange kind of stalemate. A great general trapped in a war he could no longer win, but refused to abandon. Meanwhile, Scipio had conquered Spain, capturing the silver mines and destroying Carthaginian power in the peninsula. Then, in a move that mirrored Hannibal's own strategy, he proposed to take the war to Africa itself. If Rome could threaten Carthage directly, the Carthaginian Senate would have no choice but to recall Hannibal to defend the homeland. The strategy worked. In 203 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa with a Roman army and began ravaging the countryside around Carthage. The city, panicked by the threat to its survival, sent urgent messages to Italy. Hannibal must return. The invasion of Italy, begun with such promise 16 years before, was ending not with triumph, but with recall. Hannibal prepared to leave the land that had become his home, the battleground where he had written his name into history. His soldiers, many of whom had never known another life than war in Italy, looked back at the hills and valleys where they had fought and bled. Some had married Italian women, fathered children, built lives in the intervals between campaigns. Now, all of that would be left behind. The ships gathered in the harbours of Bruttium, waiting to carry the army back to Africa. As Hannibal walked the docks, supervising the embarkation, he must have reflected on all that had been accomplished and all that had remained just beyond reach. He had crossed the Alps, defeated every Roman army sent against him, won victories that would be studied for millennia. But he had not broken Rome. The Republic, bruised and bloodied, had survived through sheer endurance, through the ability to lose battles and still continue fighting, to suffer catastrophe and still refuse defeat. The last ships departed Italian shores in the autumn of 203 BC. Behind them lay the graves of tens of thousands. Carthaginians, Romans, Gauls, Spaniards, Numidians, all mixed together in the soil of a peninsula that had witnessed some of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. Ahead lay Africa, and waiting there, a final confrontation with the young Roman general who had learned his craft by studying Hannibal's own tactics. As the Italian coast faded into the distance, Hannibal stood at the ship's rail, his one good eye watching the horizon. He was 45 years old. He had spent more than half his life at war, and the war, it seemed, was not yet finished. The years in Italy had ended not with victory or defeat, but with something more complex, a demonstration that genius alone cannot overcome the will of a nation determined to survive. Hannibal had proven himself the greatest general of his age, but Rome had proven itself something more durable than genius, a system that could absorb loss, adapt to defeat, and endure long after individual brilliance had exhausted itself. The Mediterranean stretched before him, its waters carrying him home to a final reckoning. The shadow of the Alps lay far behind, but the memory of the oath sworn in a Carthaginian temple remained, unfulfilled and unbroken, as present as it had been on that day when he was 9 years old. The shores of North Africa appeared on the horizon after days at sea, the coast rising from the blue Mediterranean like a promise or a reproach. Hannibal stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the land of his birth draw closer. a place he had left as a young man full of purpose, and now returned to as a commander summoned by necessity rather than triumph. 16 years had passed since he had last seen these harbours, and in that time he had become a legend. But legends, he was learning, do not always prevail against the arithmetic of power. The city that received him was both familiar and changed. Carthage still glittered with the wealth of centuries. Its harbours still bustled with ships from distant ports. But beneath the surface, prosperity ran currents of anxiety. Roman legions under Scipio had been ravaging the countryside for months, burning farms, besieging towns, and winning over Carthaginian allies with promises of better terms than Carthage had ever offered. The strategy was deliberate and effective. Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods in Italy and was now applying them against Carthage itself. The Carthaginian Senate, which had often been slow to support Hannibal's campaigns abroad, now greeted him with desperate hope. He was their greatest general, the man who had defeated Rome again and again. Surely he could save them now. But Hannibal, surveying the situation with his characteristic clarity, understood the difficulties. His army, though veteran and loyal, was exhausted from years of campaigning. The Italian soldiers who had followed him across the sea were far from their homes, fighting now for a cause that was not their own. And the resources he had once commanded in Spain, the silver mines, the recruitment grounds, the network of alliances, were all gone, captured by Rome or destroyed in the long war. Still, he went to work with the same methodical efficiency that had marked his entire career. He reorganized the Carthaginian forces, integrating his Italian veterans with local troops and mercenaries. He drilled them in the tactics he had perfected over decades, teaching formations and maneuvers that had broken Roman armies at the Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae. He secured supplies, repaired equipment, and sent scouts to map the Roman positions. If there was to be a final battle, and both sides understood that there would be, he would be as prepared as circumstances allowed. Scipio, meanwhile, had established a strong position near Utica, threatening Carthage from the west. The young Roman general had earned his reputation through a combination of his father's legacy and his own achievements. In Spain, he had captured New Carthage through a daring assault, studying the tides and finding a weakness in defenses that had seemed impregnable. He had defeated Carthaginian armies, won over Iberian tribes, and demonstrated a tactical flexibility that reminded many of Hannibal himself. Now, at 33 years old, he stood on African soil with a veteran army and the confidence of a man who believed destiny was on his side. For a brief period, there were negotiations. Envoys travelled between the camps, proposing terms, testing resolve. Hannibal and Scipio, the two greatest generals of their age, arranged to meet face to face before the battle. A conference between enemies who understood each other better than they understood their own politicians. The meeting took place on neutral ground, with only interpreters present. What passed between them was not recorded in detail, but the essence survived in later accounts. They spoke not as enemies, but as professionals, each recognizing in the other a quality that transcended nationality or cause. Hannibal, it was said, proposed generous terms. Carthage would cede Spain and the Mediterranean islands, would pay an indemnity, would recognize Rome's dominance in the Western Sea. In exchange, Rome would allow Carthage to survive with its African territories intact, its city unharmed, its people free. Scipio listened with courtesy, but did not accept. The terms might have been reasonable years before, but Rome had suffered too much, spent too much treasure and blood to settle for anything less than total victory. The war would be decided on the field, and Rome intended to dictate the peace that followed. The two men parted, each returning to his army, to prepare for what both knew would be the final confrontation. There was no animosity in their farewell, no theatrical displays of contempt. They were craftsmen about to demonstrate their skills, and mutual respect did not preclude the necessity of trying to destroy each other. The armies gathered near the town of ZAMA, inland from Carthage, in the autumn of 202 BC. The landscape was open and relatively flat, terrain that favored cavalry operations, an important consideration for both commanders. Hannibal's force numbered perhaps 45,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, supplemented by 80 war elephants, those creatures that had once terrified Roman soldiers, but which Roman armies had now learned to counter. Scipio commanded a slightly smaller infantry force, but superior cavalry, bolstered by Numidian horsemen under Massinissa, a local king who had once allied with Carthage, but had been won over by Roman promises and Scipio's diplomacy. The elephant charge came first, as Hannibal intended, a test of Roman resolve and an attempt to break their formation before the infantry engaged. But Scipio had prepared for this. He had arranged his infantry in columns, rather than the traditional solid line, creating corridors through which the elephants could pass without disrupting his formation. Roman trumpets and horns blared, creating noise that panicked some of the beasts, turning them back toward their own lines. Others charged through the Roman gaps and were isolated, cut down by light infantry who had trained specifically for this task. When the elephants had been neutralized, the infantry advanced. Hannibal had arranged his forces in 3 lines. First, his mercenaries and recently recruited troops. Second, his Carthaginian citizen soldiers and African allies. And third, held in reserve at the rear, his veterans from Italy. The men who had marched with him across the Alps, who had fought at Cannae and Trasimene, who represented the core of his military genius. The first line clashed with the Romans and was pushed back. The second line engaged and held longer, but eventually gave ground. Scipio's infantry, disciplined and well led, pressed forward steadily, grinding down each Carthaginian line through attrition. But they had not yet faced Hannibal's best troops, and as the afternoon wore on, the battle remained undecided in the center. The decisive moment came on the flanks. Scipio's cavalry, particularly Massinissa's Numidians, defeated their Carthaginian counterparts and drove them from the field. Then, rather than pursuing, as victorious cavalry often did, they wheeled around and returned to the battlefield, crashing into the rear of Hannibal's infantry, just as the Italian veterans were engaging the Roman center. It was Cannae in reverse, the same envelopment that Hannibal had perfected, now used against him. The Carthaginian veterans, caught between Roman infantry pressing from the front and cavalry attacking from behind, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew their cause was lost but refused to dishonor themselves. Many died where they stood, others broke and fled. The battle dissolved into a rout. Hannibal, watching his final army disintegrate, withdrew from the field with a small escort. He had been defeated, not through any failure of tactics or courage, but through the simple reality that his opponent had learned from him, had adapted his methods, and commanded superior resources. Scipio had won not because he was a better general. History would debate that question forever, but because he had the advantages of fresher troops, better cavalry, and an opponent whose greatest weapon, surprise, could no longer be employed. In the aftermath, Carthage had no choice but to accept Rome's terms. The treaty that ended the Second Punic War was harsh, but not annihilating. Carthage would surrender its fleet, retaining only 10 ships for coastal defense. It would pay a massive indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years. It would cede all territories outside Africa and agree never to wage war without Roman permission. Most painfully, it would accept the loss of independence that came with these restrictions, becoming effectively a client state of the republic it had once rivaled. Hannibal participated in the peace negotiations, using whatever influence he retained to secure the best possible terms for his city. When critics in Carthage protested the severity of the treaty, he silenced them with a simple observation: Carthage had lost. The only question now was whether it would survive its defeat. The terms, though bitter, allowed survival. Anything harsher might have meant the city's complete destruction. With the war ended, Hannibal might have retired from public life, become a private citizen living on his reputation. But that was not his nature. He had always believed that service to Carthage was his duty, and defeat did not absolve him of that obligation. In the years immediately following ZAMA, he turned his attention to civil governance, accepting appointment as suffete, one of Carthage's 2 chief magistrates. His reforms targeted the corruption that had weakened Carthage throughout the war. He restructured the tax system, eliminating the abuses that had enriched oligarchs while impoverishing the state. He audited the finances, discovering that the treasury could meet Rome's indemnity payments without additional taxation if the existing revenues were properly collected and managed. He challenged powerful families who had profited from the chaos of wartime, making enemies among the very aristocrats who should have been his supporters. The irony was bitter. Hannibal, who had fought Rome for 16 years, who had brought the Republic to the edge of collapse, was now doing more to harm Carthage's oligarchy than Rome ever had. His reforms threatened the comfortable arrangements that had survived even military defeat, and those who found their privileges diminished began to plot against him. They found allies in Rome. Roman senators, hearing reports of Hannibal's activities and influence in Carthage, grew uneasy. They remembered the general who had killed so many of their countrymen, who had brought war to Italy's doorstep. They suspected, perhaps correctly, that he still harbored dreams of revenge, that his reforms were designed to strengthen Carthage for a future conflict. Whether or not these suspicions were justified, they provided excuse for action. In 195 BC, Roman envoys arrived in Carthage with accusations that Hannibal was conspiring with Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire against Rome. The evidence was thin, possibly fabricated, but the threat was real. The Carthaginian Senate, pressured by Rome and influenced by Hannibal's domestic enemies, debated whether to hand him over for judgment. Hannibal, learning of these deliberations, understood that his presence in Carthage had become untenable. He could stay and face Roman justice, which meant certain condemnation and probable execution, or he could leave and preserve at least his freedom. The choice was not difficult. One night, quietly and without ceremony, he left the city of his birth for the last time. He traveled east toward the kingdoms that still resisted Roman expansion, seeking refuge among those who might value his experience and hate Rome as much as he did. Behind him lay Carthage, the city he had fought for and nearly destroyed Rome to save. Before him lay exile, the wandering years of a general without an army, a strategist without a state, a man whose name commanded respect, but whose power was now measured in advice rather than legions. The ships that carried him away from Africa passed the same waters he had crossed as a young commander 20 years before. But the world had changed, and so had he. The boy who had sworn an oath at an altar was now an aging exile, his father's mission unfulfilled, his own legacy suspended between triumph and tragedy. The Mediterranean sun set behind him, casting long shadows across the waves. Ahead, lay Asia, the courts of Eastern kings, and the final chapter of a life that had reshaped the ancient world. But Carthage, the city that had given him purpose and then betrayed him to preserve itself, was fading into the distance, becoming memory rather than home. The return to Africa, which should have been a homecoming, had become merely a pause between campaigns. And now, even that pause was over, replaced by exile and the uncertain promise of new battles in unfamiliar lands.